The cantina on Kepler Prime buzzed with the usual mix of voices from a dozen different species. Smoke from various alien substances hung in the air like a gray fog. In the darkest corner of the room, an old Vorthon sat alone at his table, nursing a drink that had long since gone warm. Zexathera had been coming to this same spot for 5 years now. His dark green exoskeleton bore deep scars that told stories he rarely shared. His forearms moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to live with old injuries. The younger coalition soldiers knew him by reputation, but few dared approach the famous veteran. Tonight was different. A group of fresh recruits had been drinking heavily, celebrating their first assignment to the outer colonies. Their laughter grew louder with each round and their stories grew bolder. One of them, a young Kelari with bright blue skin, noticed the scarred Vorthon in the corner. "Look there," the Kelari whispered to his friends, pointing with one of his 6 fingers. "That's Zexathera. He fought in the human war." The table fell silent. The human war had ended 20 years ago, but its shadow still hung over the coalition military. Most veterans refused to talk about it. The official records called it a complete coalition victory, but the survivors told different stories when they thought no one was listening. A brave young Nexian female approached Zexathera's table. Her silver hair gleamed under the dim lights as she spoke. "Sir, we were wondering if you might tell us about the war. The real story, not what they teach in the academy." Zexathera looked up from his drink. His compound eyes reflected the cantina's lights like broken mirrors. He studied the young soldiers for a long moment, seeing their eager faces and fresh uniforms. They reminded him of himself, back when he thought war was about glory and honor. "You don't want to hear those stories," he said, his voice rough from years of silence. "Go back to your celebration." But the young soldiers didn't move. More of them gathered around his table, drawn by curiosity and the promise of real war stories. Finally, Zexathera sighed and gestured to the empty chairs. "Sit then," he said, "but don't expect tales of glory. The human war was many things, but glorious was not one of them." The recruits settled around his table, their drinks forgotten. Zexathera stared into his glass for a moment, gathering memories he had tried to bury. 23 years ago, the Coalition Council received reports of a new species that had just developed faster than light travel. The humans, they called themselves. Intel said they were primitive, barely past their industrial age. They had simple kinetic weapons, basic ship designs, and no real military organization. He paused to take a sip of his drink, the bitter liquid helping him find his voice. The council decided they needed to be brought into the coalition properly. Not as equals, you understand, but as a junior member species. Someone had to teach them their place in the galaxy. I was a young assault commander then, eager to prove myself. When they gave me the assignment to pacify a human colony world, I thought it would be easy promotion material. A young Vorthon recruit leaned forward. "What happened, sir?" Zexathera's mandibles clicked together in what might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. New Berlin Colony was supposed to be our demonstration target. 30,000 humans, mostly farmers and miners. No military base, no defensive systems worth mentioning. My superiors told me to make it quick and clean. Show them coalition strength, accept their surrender, and move on to the next world. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, other patrons unconsciously leaning in to hear the old soldier's words. I brought 2 full battalions, 40,000 trained coalition soldiers against 30,000 human civilians. The odds were so good that some of my officers were already planning victory celebrations. We thought we would land, they would see our superior numbers and technology and surrender within hours. Zexathera's eyes grew distant as he remembered. We were wrong about everything. The moment our ships entered their atmosphere, the humans started fighting. Not just their few soldiers, but everyone. Old humans, young humans, even their children. They turned their farming equipment into weapons. Their mining tools became explosives. Their knowledge of their own world became our worst enemy. He gestured with one of his scarred arms. I got this scar on the second day of what was supposed to be a 2-hour operation. A human farmer named Jake Murphy had organized the colonists into something resembling a military force. They didn't fight like any army we knew. They would attack, disappear, then attack again somewhere else. They used tunnels, caves, even the planet's weather against us. The young soldiers listened in fascination. This was not the story they had been told in training. Murphy was a former soldier from their homeworld, but most of his people were just ordinary civilians. Teachers, doctors, shop owners. But they fought like demons. For 3 weeks they held us off with nothing but improvised weapons and pure determination. Sexthera touched another scar on his chest. This one came from a human child who couldn't have been more than 15 of their years old. She had rigged an explosive device in what looked like a medical station. When my squad went to investigate, thinking we might help wounded civilians, she detonated it, killed herself and half my team. The silence around the table was complete now. Even the background noise of the cantina seemed muted. But the worst part wasn't their weapons or their tactics. It was their eyes. When we finally captured some of them, they would look at us with this expression. Not fear, not hatred, pity, like they felt sorry for us, like they understood something we didn't. A young Kalari recruit found his voice. But sir, we won that battle, didn't we? The records show New Berlin colony was successfully pacified. Zexathera nodded slowly. Yes, we won. After a month of fighting, we had taken their main settlement. Most of the surviving humans had evacuated to the outer regions of their world. We held their towns and their farms. The council called it a victory. He paused, his compound eyes reflecting memories of smoke and fire. But Jake Murphy came to see me the night before we declared victory, walked right into our command post past all our guards like he owned the place. My soldiers had their weapons pointed at him, ready to fire, but he just asked to speak with me privately. The old veteran's voice grew quieter. He told me something that night that I've never forgotten. He said his people weren't fighting to win. They knew they couldn't beat the entire coalition. They were fighting to make us remember them. To make sure that every world we conquered after theirs would cost us more than the last. Zexathara looked around the table at the young faces watching him. He was right. After New Berlin, every human world fought harder than the last. Every battle taught them new ways to hurt us. What started as a simple pacification mission became a war that lasted 7 years and cost the coalition more ships and soldiers than any conflict in our history. The recruits sat in stunned silence. This was not the glorious victory they had been taught about. That's enough for tonight, Zexathara said, pushing back from the table. You wanted a war story. Now you have one. As he stood to leave, the young Nexian who had first approached him spoke up. Sir, will you tell us more tomorrow? Zexathara paused, his hand on the back of his chair. Come back tomorrow night and I'll tell you about the siege of New Berlin. But remember this, every story I tell you is true. And every truth makes the next one harder to hear. He walked away, leaving the young soldiers to contemplate their first real lesson about the cost of war. The next evening, more soldiers had gathered around Zexathara's usual table. Word had spread through the station about the old Vorthan stories. Officers who normally wouldn't associate with enlisted personnel sat next to fresh recruits, all waiting to hear more about the human war. Zexathara arrived later than usual, moving slowly through the crowded cantina. His scarred exoskeleton caught the light as he settled into his chair. The crowd around his table had doubled since the night before, but he didn't seem surprised. You came back, he said simply, ordering his usual drink from a passing server. I suppose you want to hear about New Berlin. A young officer, a Kalari captain with pristine uniform decorations, leaned forward eagerly. The Academy teaches that New Berlin was our greatest strategic victory in the human war. Is that true? Zexathara's mandibles clicked in that humorless laugh again. Strategic victory. Yes, I suppose the council would call it that. We did take the colony eventually. But victory has many definitions. He waited for his drink to arrive, then began his story. After Jake Murphy's visit, I thought I understood what we were dealing with. I was wrong again. The real battle for New Berlin hadn't even started yet. What we had seen in the first month was just their warm-up. The assembled soldiers listened intently as Zexathara's voice took on the cadence of a professional military briefing. The humans had used the month of fighting to evacuate most of their non-combatants to the outer settlements. What remained in New Berlin City were the fighters, about 8,000 humans who had decided to make their final stand. My superiors reinforced my command with 3 more battalions, 200,000 coalition soldiers against 8,000 humans. He paused to let the numbers sink in. Those should have been impossible odds. Any rational species would have surrendered immediately. But humans, as I was learning, don't think like rational species. A young Nexian engineer raised her hand tentatively. What made them so difficult to fight, sir? Our weapons were better, our numbers greater. Zexathara nodded approvingly at the question. Good question. The answer is that humans don't fight the way we do. We fight to win battles, control territory, achieve objectives. Humans fight to make you remember them. He took a long drink, organizing his thoughts. The human commander for the siege was a woman named Lisa Rodriguez. She had been Jake Murphy's second in command, and she was everything Murphy was, but more focused, more dangerous. She knew she couldn't win a traditional battle, so she didn't fight one. Zexthara gestured around the cantina with one of his arms. Imagine this room is New Berlin City. Traditional military thinking says you control the room by holding the center and the exits. Rodriguez let us have the center and most of the exits. Then she made holding them so expensive that we started to wonder if they were worth having. The old veteran's eyes grew distant with memory. The humans had spent years mining their world. They knew every tunnel, every cave, every underground passage. While we held the surface, they moved through the ground beneath us like ghosts. A coalition patrol would be walking down a street, and suddenly half of them would fall through the ground into prepared traps. He touched a scar on his upper arm. This came from their favorite trick. They would rig buildings to collapse when we entered them, but they would time it so that we would be injured, not killed. Wounded soldiers require medical attention, evacuation, resources. Dead soldiers just require body bags. A Vorthan sergeant spoke up. That seems inefficient, sir. Wouldn't killing enemies be more effective? Zexathara's compound eyes fixed on the young soldier. That's what I thought at the time. I was wrong. Dead soldiers don't tell stories. They don't go home to their families and explain what they saw. They don't wake up screaming in the night, remembering human faces. The cantina had grown quiet around them. Other patrons had stopped their own conversations to listen to the war stories. The siege lasted 4 months. 4 months of constant, grinding warfare where we never knew if the ground beneath our feet would hold, if the building next to us would explode, if the human civilian approaching our checkpoint was carrying medical supplies or explosives. Zexathara's voice grew softer, more personal. I lost more soldiers in those 4 months than in the rest of my career combined. Not because the humans were better fighters, but because they made every single day cost us something. Sleep, sanity, the ability to trust our own senses. He paused, lost in memory. There was a human doctor named Alex Foster who ran a medical clinic in the city center. For weeks he treated our wounded soldiers alongside human civilians. My medical officers reported that his surgical skills were beyond anything they had seen. He saved the lives of dozens of my troops. The assembled soldiers waited, sensing there was more to the story. Then we discovered that Dr. Foster was also the leader of the Human Intelligence Network. Every coalition soldier he saved went back to duty with microscopic tracking devices in their bodies. For 3 months, the humans knew exactly where every one of my units was located. A young officer gasped, "That's impossible." Our medical scanners would detect any foreign objects. Zexathara shook his head. Human medical technology was more advanced than we realized. They could build tracking devices from biological materials that our scanners read as natural tissue. When we finally figured it out, we had to recall and examine every soldier Foster had treated. He took another drink, the liquid seeming to help him continue. But the worst part was that Foster kept saving our lives even after we knew what he was doing. When we confronted him, he said that his oath as a doctor came before his duty as a soldier. He would treat anyone who needed help, even his enemies. The silence around the table was profound. Several of the younger soldiers looked disturbed by the implications. The end came suddenly. For 4 months, we had been fighting for control of a city that the humans could have abandoned at any time. They stayed because leaving would have been easier, and humans seemed to have an allergy to easy solutions. Zexathara's voice grew heavy with old pain. Lisa Rodriguez sent me a message on the final day. She said her people had accomplished what they came to do. They had shown us that conquering human worlds would cost more than we ever imagined. Then she thanked me for treating her people with honor during the siege. He looked around the table at the young faces watching him. The humans evacuated New Berlin City that night, all 8,000 of them moving through tunnels we never knew existed. They left behind a city that was technically intact but completely uninhabitable. Every building had been rigged with delayed explosives. Every water source had been contaminated. Every piece of infrastructure had been sabotaged. A young Kalari recruit found his voice. So we won nothing? Zexthara nodded slowly. We won a city that would take years to rebuild and months to make safe. We won casualties that took years to replace. We won the knowledge that every human world would fight exactly as hard as New Berlin had, and that each one would be more expensive than the last. He stood up from his table, signaling the end of the evening's story, but most importantly, we won something else. We won the certainty that humans would never fight a war the way we expected them to. Every battle after New Berlin was fought in the shadow of Lisa Rodriguez's siege tactics. As the old veteran prepared to leave, the same young Nexian from the night before spoke up. "Sir, what happened to Rodriguez and the other humans from New Berlin?" Zexthara paused, his hand on his chair. "Rodriguez survived the war. Last I heard, she was teaching military tactics at a human academy, teaching other humans how to fight impossible battles. Dr. Foster died in the final year of the war, treating wounded soldiers from both sides during the Battle of Luna." He looked around the table one more time. "Tomorrow night, I'll tell you about the ghost ship incident. But tonight, remember this. New Berlin taught us that humans don't fight to win battles. They fight to make sure that winning battles cost you everything you thought victory was worth." With that, he walked away, leaving the young soldiers to contemplate the true meaning of strategic victory. He stood up again, preparing to end the night's story. After the Defiance incident, Admiral Korth was the fourth night brought the largest crowd yet. Word of Zexthara's stories had spread beyond the military community on Kepler Prime. Civilian contractors, merchant captains, even some of the station's diplomatic staff had found reasons to visit the cantina. The management had moved additional tables and chairs to accommodate everyone who wanted to hear about the human war. Zexthara arrived to find his corner transformed into an impromptu amphitheater. Someone had set up recording equipment, and he noticed several people taking notes. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he had committed to telling these stories, and he would see it through. "This is quite a crowd," he observed, settling into his chair. "I hope you're prepared for a darker story tonight. What I'm going to tell you about Mars isn't a tale of noble sacrifice or heroic last stands. It's about what happens when war goes on too long and both sides forget what they're fighting for." The assembled audience grew quiet, sensing the change in the old veteran's tone. By the 5th year of the war, the coalition had occupied 17 human worlds. Mars was one of the first to fall, and it had been under our control for nearly 3 years when I was assigned there as occupation commander. The initial conquest had been swift and successful. No dramatic battles, no significant casualties on either side. Zexthara accepted his usual drink but didn't taste it immediately. Mars looked like a model occupation. The human population appeared cooperative. They followed coalition directives, maintained their infrastructure, and even helped with administrative functions. My superiors used it as an example of how human worlds could be successfully integrated into the coalition. A young Kalari intelligence officer raised her hand. "Sir, if the occupation was successful, why were you assigned there?" Zexthara's mandibles clicked in grim amusement. "Because successful occupations don't require veteran commanders with experience in human warfare. I was sent to Mars because strange things had been happening. Supply convoys were disappearing. Communication arrays were failing. Coalition personnel were having accidents at an alarming rate." He finally took a sip of his drink, using the pause to organize his thoughts. On the surface, everything looked normal. The human population went to work, maintained their families, and interacted politely with coalition forces. But underneath, something else was happening. Something we didn't understand until it was too late. The cantina had grown so quiet that the soft hum of the station's life support systems was audible. The resistance on Mars wasn't organized like a military force. There was no central command, no clear leadership structure, no obvious communication network. Instead, it was like fighting a disease that had infected the entire population. Zexthara gestured with one of his scarred arms. A coalition transport would break down on a remote road. The human repair technician would fix it perfectly, but somehow a critical component would fail again 3 days later. A communication relay would be sabotaged, and the human engineer who repaired it would do excellent work. But the system would develop a different problem within a week. A Vorthan logistics officer looked confused. "Sir, that sounds more like incompetence than sabotage." "That's what we thought at first," Zexthara replied. "But the pattern was too consistent, too subtle. It took me months to realize what was happening. The humans weren't trying to stop our operations completely. They were trying to make everything we did just a little bit harder, a little bit more expensive, a little bit less reliable." He looked around at the faces watching him. The leader of this invisible resistance was a man named Peter Harrison. On paper, he was a geology professor at Mars University who had cooperated fully with the occupation. He taught coalition officers about Martian terrain, advised on mining operations, and even translated human scientific documents for our research teams. Zexathara's voice grew softer, more personal. I met Dr. Harrison dozens of times during my first year on Mars. He was helpful, knowledgeable, and seemed genuinely interested in peaceful cooperation between humans and the coalition. He invited me to dinner at his home, introduced me to his family, and even taught me some human history. The audience sensed there was more to this story. Harrison had a daughter named Jenny, maybe 16 human years old. She was studying computer programming and often helped her father with his geological surveys. Bright, curious, always asking questions about coalition technology and culture. She seemed fascinated by the differences between species. Zexathara paused, his compound eyes reflecting painful memories. What I didn't know was that Jenny Park, as she called herself online, was the primary coordinator for the entire Martian resistance network. While I was having dinner with her family, she was using her computer skills to infiltrate coalition data systems and coordinate sabotage operations across the planet. Several of the younger soldiers looked shocked. An older Nexian officer nodded grimly, recognizing the implications. The humans had weaponized their children's education. Every young human studying engineering, computer science, or applied physics was part of the resistance. They learned coalition technology not to cooperate with us, but to find better ways to sabotage it. Zexathara took another drink, steadying himself for the next part of the story. The resistance cell in the capital city was run out of a human medical clinic. The doctor was a man named Steve Baker, a former military officer who had been treating both human and coalition personnel since the occupation began. His clinic had an excellent reputation. Even my own medical staff would refer difficult cases to him. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the serving staff had stopped moving to listen. Dr. Baker was saving coalition lives by day and planning coalition deaths by night. He knew our medical procedures, our physical vulnerabilities, even our individual health records. When the resistance needed to eliminate specific coalition personnel, Baker would provide detailed information about their weaknesses. A young medical officer in the audience looked disturbed. "Sir, that's a violation of every medical oath I know of." Zexathara fixed the young officer with his compound gaze. That's what I thought when I discovered the truth. I confronted Dr. Baker directly, demanding to know how he could reconcile healing coalition soldiers with planning their deaths. He paused, remembering the conversation. Baker told me something I've never forgotten. He said that he treated every patient who came to his clinic because that was his duty as a doctor, but he also fought against the occupation because that was his duty as a human being. He said the two duties didn't contradict each other. They just operated on different levels. The audience struggled to understand the implications. When we finally uncovered the full extent of the Martian resistance, we discovered it involved nearly the entire human population. Teachers were encoding resistance messages in school lessons. Shopkeepers were using their businesses to pass information. Even children were carrying out surveillance and minor sabotage operations. Zexathara's voice grew, heavy with old pain. But the most disturbing discovery was that they had been helping us as much as they had been hurting us. For every coalition operation they sabotaged, they had quietly prevented two others from failing due to human negligence or misunderstanding. They had been managing our occupation, making sure it was successful enough to avoid harsh crackdowns, but never so successful that we could move on to other priorities. A Kalari strategic analyst looked puzzled. "Sir, why would they want to prolong the occupation?" "Because every year we spent on Mars was a year we weren't conquering other human worlds. Every resource we devoted to managing their resistance was a resource that wasn't being used to fight the war elsewhere. They were sacrificing themselves to protect other human populations." The implications of this strategy began to dawn on the assembled officers. By the time I understood what the Martian humans were doing, it was too late to change our approach. We were committed to maintaining the occupation, but we could never trust that it was secure. Every human who smiled and cooperated with us might be planning our downfall. Every act of helpfulness might be concealing an act of sabotage. Zexathara stood up and walked to the viewing window again, looking out at the stars. The worst part was that some of them genuinely were trying to help us. Dr. Harrison really did want peaceful cooperation between our species. Dr. Baker, really did believe in his medical oath. Jenny really was curious about coalition culture. He turned back to face the audience. But they were also part of a resistance movement that was slowly, methodically undermining everything we were trying to accomplish. They had found a way to be, simultaneously, our greatest allies and our most dangerous enemies. The cantina remained silent as everyone processed the implications of this revelation. The Martian resistance taught me that humans don't think about war the way we do. We fight to achieve objectives and then move on to other priorities. Humans fight to transform the nature of the conflict itself. They turn victories into burdens and occupations into ongoing commitments that drain resources and morale. Zexthara returned to his seat, looking older than he had at the beginning of the evening. I remained on Mars for 2 more years after uncovering the resistance network. In that time, by the 3rd night, Zexthara's corner of the cantina had become unofficial coalition territory. Officers had rearranged tables to accommodate the growing crowd of listeners. Even some of the station's civilian population had begun to gather at the edges, drawn by stories they had never heard before. Zexthara entered to find his usual chair waiting for him, surrounded by expectant faces. The crowd had grown to include some species he didn't recognize, probably traders and merchants who worked the outer rim routes. War stories traveled fast in places like Kepler Prime. "You're early tonight," observed the same young Nexian who had started this whole affair 3 nights ago. Her silver hair had been braided with small metal ornaments that marked her as an engineering specialist. "Am I?" Zexthara settled into his chair and looked around at the assembled crowd. "Perhaps you're all just eager to hear more about how badly we underestimated the humans." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the audience. By now, they had begun to understand that these were not the victory stories they had expected. "Tonight, I want to tell you about the UCS Defiance," Zexthara began, accepting his usual drink from a server who had learned to anticipate his order. It was a human destroyer that changed how we thought about sacrifice. He took a sip of his drink and gazed into the amber liquid as if he could see the past reflected there. This happened in the 4th year of the war. By then we had learned to respect human ground forces, but we still believed we held the advantage in space combat. Our ships were larger, better armed, and crewed by professional soldiers rather than the mix of military and civilian personnel that humans used. A young Vorthon officer leaned forward. "The records show we maintained naval superiority throughout the war, sir." Zexthara's mandibles clicked. "The records show many things, but they don't tell you about the nights when entire battle fleets would change course to avoid single human ships, or why experienced captains would request transfers rather than patrol human space." The cantina had grown quiet again. Other conversations had died as patrons strained to hear the war veteran's words. The Defiance was part of a human convoy trying to evacuate civilians from the Kepler system. Nothing special about it, just another destroyer in a fleet of cargo ships and transports. My battle group intercepted them near the edge of the system. Zexthara paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lights. The engagement should have been simple. We had 3 heavy cruisers and 8 destroyers. They had 5 cargo ships, 2 transports, and 1 military vessel. Standard tactics said they should have surrendered immediately to preserve civilian lives. He shook his head slowly. Instead, the Defiance moved to position itself between our fleet and their civilian ships. It launched every fighter it had, probably less than 20 small craft, and began broadcasting on all frequencies. They were calling for us to allow the civilian evacuation to proceed safely. A Kalari engineer raised one of his 6 hands. "What did your commander do, sir?" Admiral Korth did what any rational military commander would do. He ignored the broadcast and ordered the attack. The civilians were the real target anyway. Evacuees would just resettle on other worlds and continue the war effort. Zexthara's voice grew quieter, more reflective. The Defiance fought like nothing I had ever seen. It was outgunned 50-1, but it didn't try to run or surrender. It flew straight at our heaviest cruiser, taking fire from every ship in our fleet. By the time it reached us, it should have been space debris. He gestured with one scarred arm. But human ships are built differently than ours. Where we focus on heavy armor and powerful weapons, they build for damage control and redundancy. The Defiance absorbed enough firepower to destroy 3 coalition vessels and kept fighting. The audience was completely absorbed now. Even the background noise of the cantina seemed muted. The human ship rammed our flagship, Not a glancing blow or an accident, but a deliberate, calculated attack. Commander Ryan Bell, the captain of the Defiance, had flown his ship directly into Admiral Korth's command vessel at full combat speed. Zexathera took a long drink before continuing. Both ships were catastrophically damaged. The flagship was crippled and drifting. The Defiance was broken in half but somehow still had power to some sections. The human civilian ships had used the distraction to escape into hyperspace. A young Nexian mechanic spoke up. So the humans succeeded in their mission? Yes and no, Zexathera replied. The civilians escaped, but the cost was enormous. The Defiance had been a frontline military vessel with over 300 crew members. They sacrificed themselves to save maybe 1,000 civilian evacuees. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But that wasn't the end of the story. Admiral Korth ordered boarding parties to search the wreckage of the human ship. Intelligence value, you understand. Human ship technology, computer files, anything that might help us understand their tactics. Zexathera's expression grew distant. I led one of the boarding teams. The Defiance was a wreck, torn apart by our weapons and the collision. Most of it was vacuum and twisted metal, but the bridge section was still pressurized, still had life support. The cantina was silent now. Every person in the room was listening to the old veteran's words. We found 2 humans alive in the bridge. Commander Bell and his chief engineer, a woman named Carol Davis. They had been trapped there since the collision, probably for several hours. Bell was badly injured. Davis was trying to treat his wounds with a basic medical kit. Zexathera's voice grew softer. They weren't afraid when we found them. Bell looked at me and asked if the civilian ships had escaped safely. When I told him they had, he smiled. Davis just nodded and went back to treating his injuries. A young soldier asked, "What did you do with them, sir?" Standard procedure called for immediate prisoner processing and interrogation. But something about their behavior bothered me. They were too calm, too accepting. Bell kept checking his watch and looking at Davis with an expression I couldn't read. Zexathera stood up from his chair and walked to the cantina's large viewing window, looking out at the stars beyond the station. I had been fighting humans for 4 years by then. I had learned to recognize their patterns, their tactics, their way of thinking. These 2 were planning something. He returned to his seat, his movements careful and deliberate. I ordered my team to search the bridge more carefully. Davis watched us work with a strange expression, almost like she was proud of something. Bell kept glancing at a control panel that had been damaged in the fighting. The audience waited, sensing they were approaching the climax of the story. We found the first explosive device hidden behind the navigation console, then another one near the life support systems, then more, scattered throughout the intact sections of the ship. The entire bridge had been rigged to explode. Several of the younger soldiers gasped. An older Kalari officer nodded grimly, recognizing the implications. The humans had spent their trapped time turning their own bridge into a bomb. They could have triggered it the moment we boarded, taking my entire team with them. Instead, they had waited. Zexathera's compound eyes focused on nothing, lost in memory. I asked Bell why they hadn't detonated immediately. He said they wanted to make sure we understood their message. Davis added that they hoped to convince us to treat other human prisoners more fairly. He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. Then Bell told me something that haunts me still. He said they had given us 10 minutes to evacuate our boarding parties and return to our ships. After that, the Defiance would complete its final mission. A young Vorthon recruit found his voice. "What final mission, sir?" Zexathera looked directly at the young soldier. The civilian evacuation was just the first part of their plan. The real mission was to cripple our battle fleet. The explosives weren't just in the bridge. They were connected to the ship's antimatter containment system. Understanding dawned on several faces in the crowd. They had turned the entire Defiance into a massive bomb. When it exploded, it would take out any coalition ships within 1,000 kilometers, including the damaged flagship with Admiral Korth aboard. The silence in the cantina was profound. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped. I had 9 minutes to evacuate 3 boarding teams and get our ships to minimum safe distance. Bell and Davis sat calmly in their damaged bridge, making sure we had time to escape. Zexathera's voice grew heavy with old pain. I asked them why they were giving us the chance to flee. Davis said that killing us would accomplish nothing except creating more widows and orphans on both sides. Bell added that they hoped we would remember their choice when we encountered other human civilians. He took a long drink, the liquid seeming to steady him. We made it to safe distance with 30 seconds to spare. The Defiance exploded exactly when Bell had promised it would. The blast took out 2 of our damaged cruisers and left the flagship so badly damaged that it had to be abandoned. The old veteran looked around the table at the young faces watching him, but the worst part wasn't the ships we lost or the soldiers who died. It was the knowledge that 2 humans had held our entire battle fleet hostage and then chosen to let us live. They could have killed us all, but they gave us the chance to escape because they thought mercy was more important than victory. The 5th night brought more than just listeners. Zexathera arrived at the cantina to find news crews setting up equipment and official-looking individuals in expensive suits occupying several tables. Word of his stories had apparently reached the upper levels of station administration, and possibly beyond. "I see we have distinguished guests tonight," Zexathera observed, settling into his usual chair despite the cameras and recording devices aimed in his direction. "I hope you're prepared for the final chapter of this story. What I'm going to tell you about Luna Base will explain why the human war ended the way it did, and why veterans like me have nightmares about victories we're supposed to celebrate." The crowd was larger than ever, filling not just his corner but most of the cantina. Station security had been called in to manage the crowd, and several high-ranking coalition officers sat at tables near the front. Zexathera recognized a few faces from military intelligence and political affairs. "The 7th and final year of the human war began with the fall of Earth," Zexathera said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. It should have been the end of everything. Earth was humanity's homeworld, their cultural and political center. When our fleets broke through their defenses and forced the planetary surrender, most of my colleagues believed the war was over. He paused to let his drink arrive, noting that even the serving staff moved more quietly tonight. But humans, as I had learned over 6 years of fighting them, don't surrender the way other species do. The fall of Earth wasn't the end of their resistance, it was the transformation of it into something even more dangerous. A young Vorthon intelligence officer leaned forward. "Sir, our records show that organized human military resistance collapsed after Earth surrendered." "How could they be more dangerous?" Zexathera's mandibles clicked in that familiar, humorless laugh. "Organized resistance, yes. But by then, humans had learned not to depend on organization. They had learned to fight as individuals, as families, as small groups united only by shared purpose." He gestured toward the viewing window and the stars beyond. The final human stronghold was Luna Base, on Earth's moon. It wasn't a particularly impressive facility, just a military installation and research complex that housed maybe 50,000 people. The Coalition High Command expected it to surrender within days of Earth's fall. The audience waited, understanding by now that human expectations rarely aligned with Coalition predictions. Instead, Luna Base declared itself the new capital of humanity and announced that the war would continue. Their leader was Admiral Kate Morrison, a woman who had commanded human naval forces throughout the war. She broadcast a message to every Coalition world, promising that humanity would fight until every last human was dead. Zexathera's voice grew softer, more reflective. "At first we thought it was empty posturing. What could 50,000 humans on a moon base accomplish against the entire Coalition? We had conquered their homeworld, destroyed their fleets, and scattered their population across 100 refugee camps." He took a sip of his drink, organizing his thoughts. Admiral Morrison's first action was to release every piece of human scientific and technological knowledge to any species that wanted it. Medical research, agricultural techniques, industrial processes, even military technology. She called it humanity's farewell gift to the galaxy. Several of the listeners looked surprised. This wasn't the behavior they expected from a defeated enemy. The Coalition Council was furious. Here we were, finally winning the war, and the humans were giving away the very knowledge we had been trying to capture. Morrison's broadcasts made it clear that she intended to make human technology worthless as spoils of war. Zexathera looked around at the faces watching him, noting the mixture of military personnel, civilians, and officials. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of her strategy. Morrison also began broadcasting detailed information about Coalition war crimes, military failures, and political corruption. She had somehow gained access to classified Coalition communications and was sharing them with everyone. A Kalari political officer at one of the front tables shifted uncomfortably. For 7 years, the Coalition public had been told that the human war was a police action to integrate a primitive species into galactic civilization. Morrison's broadcast revealed the true cost of the war, the extent of coalition casualties, and the nature of human resistance. Zexathara's expression grew grim. Public support for the war began to collapse on coalition worlds. Families who had lost soldiers started demanding explanations. Political opposition groups used Morrison's information to challenge government policies. The humans were winning the propaganda war even as they lost the military one. He stood up and walked to the center of the room, addressing the entire crowd rather than just the tables immediately around him. The final assault on Luna Base was scheduled to end the war once and for all. Every available coalition ship was assigned to the operation. It was supposed to be a demonstration of overwhelming force that would show the galaxy what happened to species that defied the coalition. The cantina was completely silent. Even the background noise from the station system seemed muted. I commanded one of the assault battalions tasked with taking the base's command center. Intelligence reports suggested that Admiral Morrison and her senior staff were coordinating the last human resistance from a fortified bunker deep within the facility. Thara's voice took on the cadence of a military briefing. The battle for Luna Base lasted 18 hours. Human defenders fought for every corridor, every room, every piece of equipment. But they were outnumbered 100 to 1 and they had nowhere to retreat. By hour 16, coalition forces controlled most of the facility. He paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights. That's when Admiral Morrison made her final broadcast. She announced that Luna Base had accomplished its mission. Humanity had shared its knowledge with the galaxy, exposed the truth about the war, and demonstrated that some things were worth dying for. The audience waited, sensing they were approaching the climax of not just this story, but all the stories Zexathara had told over the past week. Then Morrison did something that changed the nature of the war forever. She offered the coalition a gift that we couldn't refuse and couldn't understand. Zexathara returned to his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. For the past 3 months, a plague called the Xerion syndrome had been spreading through coalition worlds. It affected all of our major species, causing a wasting disease that our medical science couldn't cure. Millions of coalition citizens were dying, and our best researchers had found no treatment. Several of the medical personnel in the audience began to understand where the story was heading. Admiral Morrison announced that human researchers had developed a cure for Xerion syndrome. She was prepared to share the cure freely with coalition medical authorities, asking nothing in return except that the war be allowed to end with dignity. The silence in the cantina was profound. Everyone understood the implications of this revelation. The coalition high command faced an impossible choice. They could complete the conquest of Luna Base and end the human war with a decisive victory, or they could accept the cure and save millions of coalition lives. But they couldn't do both because Morrison made it clear that the cure would only be shared if Luna Base was allowed to surrender with honor. Zexathara's voice grew, heavy with emotion. I was in the command bunker when Admiral Morrison made her offer directly to coalition leadership. She was an elderly human woman, probably in her 70s, who had spent 7 years fighting the most powerful military force in the galaxy. She looked exhausted, beaten, ready to accept defeat. He paused, remembering the moment. But when she offered us the cure, she wasn't asking for mercy or special treatment. She was asking us to choose what kind of victory we wanted to achieve. She said we could choose to be conquerors who won by destroying our enemies, or we could choose to be civilized beings who won by transcending the need for enemies. The audience was completely absorbed, hanging on every word. The Coalition Council spent 6 hours debating Morrison's offer. Some wanted to reject it and complete the military victory. Others argued that accepting would save more lives than the conquest of Luna Base was worth. In the end, they made a decision that satisfied no one and haunted everyone. Zexathara took a long drink before continuing. They accepted the cure and allowed Luna Base to surrender with honors of war. Admiral Morrison and her surviving personnel were treated as prisoners of war rather than rebels. The human war ended not with a great battle, but with a medical exchange and a formal surrender ceremony. He looked around the room at the faces watching him. But the real end of the war came 3 days later, when Admiral Morrison died of natural causes in Coalition custody. She had been suffering from Xerion syndrome herself and had refused treatment until the cure was safely in Coalition hands. Her final act was to ensure that the knowledge that saved millions of our people came at the cost of her own life. The cantina remained. silent as everyone processed the implications of this revelation. The cure worked exactly as Morrison had promised. Within months, Xerian syndrome was eliminated from Coalition worlds. Millions of lives were saved, including members of my own family who had contracted the disease. Zexathara's voice grew. The sixth night brought an atmosphere unlike any of the previous evenings. News of Zexathara's stories had spread beyond Kepler Prime, transmitted across the communication networks that connected Coalition worlds. The cantina was packed not just with curious listeners, but with other veterans who had come to hear someone finally speak the truths they had. Carried in silence for 2 decades, Zexathara entered, to find his usual chair surrounded by fellow survivors of the human war. Scarred Vorthans, aging Kalari, grizzled Nexians who bore the same haunted expressions he saw in his own reflection. They nodded to him with the quiet respect that passed between soldiers who had shared experiences too complex for words. "I see I'm not the only one with stories to tell tonight," Zexathara observed, settling into his chair. Around the room he could see other veterans preparing to speak, as if his week of storytelling had given them permission to finally share their own memories. "Tonight, I want to tell you about what happened after the victory parades ended, and the politicians stopped making speeches about our glorious conquest of humanity," he began. "I want to tell you about the 20 years that followed the human war, and why some victories are more dangerous than any defeat." The crowd was the largest yet, filling the cantina and spilling out into the corridor beyond. Station management had set up speakers to carry Zexathara's words to everyone who wanted to hear them. The war ended in Coalition year 2387, with humanity defeated, their worlds occupied, and their population scattered across refugee camps and resettlement colonies. By every measure that military strategists use, we had achieved a complete and decisive victory. Zexathara paused to accept his drink, noting that several other veterans in the crowd were drinking heavily tonight. He understood the impulse. But victory in war is like surgery and medicine. Success isn't measured by how well you perform the operation, but by whether the patient survives and thrives afterward. And in the 20 years since the human war ended, the Coalition has been slowly dying from complications of our victory. A young Kalari political officer looked confused. "Sir, Coalition territory has expanded, our economy has grown, and our military is stronger than ever." "How is that dying?" An old Vorthan veteran at a nearby table laughed bitterly. "Tell him about the veteran suicide rates, Zexathara. Tell him about the recruitment problems. Tell him about why experienced officers refuse combat assignments." Zexathara nodded to his fellow veteran. "Thank you, Commander Thok. Yes, let's talk about the hidden costs of our great victory over humanity." He looked around the room, his compound eyes taking in faces both young and old. Within 5 years of the war's end, veteran suicide rates across Coalition species had increased by 400%, not from trauma or injury, though those were factors, but from something the medical corps called moral injury syndrome. Soldiers who had fought humans couldn't reconcile what they had done with who they thought they were. The cantina grew quiet, the weight of this revelation settling over the crowd. The Coalition military began having trouble recruiting new soldiers. Young people from every member species started refusing military service, not from cowardice but from disgust. They had heard the real stories of the human war from returning veterans, and they wanted no part of that kind of victory. Zexathara took a sip of his drink, steadying himself for what came next. But the most serious problem was what happened to human populations after the war. The Coalition Council had promised that defeated humans would be integrated into galactic society as productive citizens. What actually happened was very different. He gestured to another veteran in the crowd, a Nexian female with silver hair and deep scars across her face. Captain Vexiandra was stationed on human resettlement worlds after the war. She can tell you what integration actually looked like. The scarred Nexian stood slowly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cantina. "Integration was a lie," she said simply. "The humans were placed in camps that were prisons in everything but name. They were given work assignments that amounted to slave labor. Their children were separated from their families and sent to education facilities designed to eliminate human culture and identity." She paused, her hands shaking slightly. "I spent 3 years overseeing human work camps on Kepler 7. Every day, I watched as the people who had fought so bravely during the war were systematically broken down and dehumanized. And every day I became less sure about what we had actually won. Captain Vexandra sat down, and Zexathera continued the story. The Human Integration Program was designed by coalition politicians who had never fought humans, never spoken to them, never seen the look in their eyes when they chose death over surrender. These politicians thought humans were just another conquered species that could be managed and controlled. The audience was completely absorbed, understanding that they were hearing classified information that had never been made public. But humans don't break the way other species do. Instead of submitting to integration, they began dying. Not from disease or violence, but from despair. Human suicide rates in the camps were astronomical. Entire families would choose death rather than accept the life the coalition was offering them. A young Borthan medical officer looked horrified. "Sir, didn't anyone try to stop this?" Another veteran, a Kalari with burns covering half his body, stood up to answer. "Some of us tried," he said, his voice hoarse with old pain. "I was Commander Jexthul of the post-war administration on New Terra Colony. When I saw what was happening to human populations, I filed reports with Coalition Command, requesting changes to integration policies." He looked around the room with bitter eyes. "I was told that human deaths were an acceptable cost of maintaining order. When I continued to protest, I was relieved of command and transferred to a logistics position. Other officers who tried to help humans were court-martialed for excessive sympathy with former enemies." Commander Jexthul sat down, and the weight of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Zexathera took up the narrative again. By the 10th year after the war, Coalition intelligence estimated that half of the human population had died in the camps, not from deliberate extermination but from despair, disease, and the simple inability to survive in the conditions we provided for them. The silence in the cantina was profound. Many of the younger soldiers looked shocked while the veterans nodded grimly. But the humans who survived did something that changed everything. They began teaching their children the stories of the war. Not the official coalition version, but the real stories of human resistance, sacrifice, and moral courage. Zexathara's voice grew stronger, more urgent. These children grew up in coalition camps, but they carried human values in their hearts. They learned about Jake Murphy's last stand, Lisa Rodriguez's siege tactics, Admiral Morrison's final choice. They became living reminders of what their parents had fought for. A young Nexian recruit raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, what happened to those children?" "They grew up," Zexathera replied simply. "And 15 years after the war ended, they began to change the galaxy in ways none of us expected." He stood up and walked to the center of the room, addressing the entire crowd. Human refugees who had been scattered across coalition space began to establish themselves in legitimate professions. Doctors, teachers, engineers, artists. They took coalition names, learned coalition languages, and integrated into our society in ways the camps never achieved. The audience waited, sensing that the story was building toward its conclusion, but they carried human ideas with them, concepts like individual dignity, moral choice, and the right to resist unjust authority. They taught these ideas to their coalition colleagues, their neighbors, their friends. Zexathera's voice grew passionate. Within a generation, human refugees had begun to transform coalition society from within. Not through violence or rebellion, but through example. They showed us what it meant to choose principle over convenience, integrity over advantage, compassion over efficiency. He looked around the room at the faces watching him. Today, 20 years after our great victory over humanity, the most popular political movements on coalition worlds are those advocating for individual rights, democratic governance, and restrictions on military power. The fastest-growing philosophical schools teach human concepts of ethics and moral responsibility. A Kalari political analyst at one of the front tables looked disturbed. "Sir, are you suggesting that humans won the war after losing it?" Zexathera's mandibles clicked in something that might have been a smile. "I'm suggesting that there are different kinds of victory. We conquered human worlds, but human ideas conquered our minds. We destroyed their military, but their values transformed our society. We won the war, but they won the peace." He walked back to his chair, preparing to conclude his final story. The irony of the human war is that everything the coalition tried to prevent has happened anyway. Human influence over galactic civilization is greater now than it ever would have been if we had simply left them alone. We created the very future we feared by fighting so hard to prevent it. The old veteran sat down heavily, looking older than he had at any point during the week of storytelling. That,